Alright, having discussed the taxonomy of philosophy, let us now proceed to the value of philosophy. Now, philosophy, as you might know, is one of the liberal arts, and at least one way to see what makes the liberal arts different from the other fields of study is that it is the study, or it is the field of study of the free person. Okay, so admittedly, it is not among the most practical disciplines. However, I'll try to give some reasons why philosophers of across time have thought of philosophy as valuable or important. So, as you may remember, last time we talked about axiology, right? It is the study of value, and we'll be doing a bit of that, at least roughly, in this short discussion. All right, first, philosophy disciplines the human mind. So, notice that in philosophy there are higher cognitive standards than the cognitive standards required of us in day-to-day life. So, for example, I cannot you cannot demand me in my day-to-day conversations to be 100% clear in the definitions of the words that I'm using, to be that all my arguments would be structured in a completely valid way, right? Because that is not the requiring these is not part of day-to-day life. When we do philosophy, we have to discipline our mind, because, as I said earlier, it has higher cognitive standards, and consequently, when we do that, we practice the habit of thinking critically, and consequently, when we meet illogical ideas uttered by somebody else perhaps, or by ourselves, we can shield ourselves from believing in those things, right? Because we meet false ideas every day, almost every day, especially through the advent of social media, right? So, in one sense, philosophy disciplines the human mind by preventing us, in a sense, vaccinating us from the virus of false ideas, of bad arguments. After all, as also said earlier, or last time, Ludwig Wittgenstein said that the object of philosophy is the logical clarification of thought. Right? Remember? So at least one of the features of philosophy is that it forces you to be precise in your use of terms. Right? We will strive to avoid ambiguity. We have to clarify in what sense we are using the term justice, for instance, in Plato, or in what sense is the word existence distinct in the thought of Aquinas and existence in the thought of Sartre, right? Jean-Paul Sartre. So, this practice of clarification of the terms that we're using is commonly done in philosophy, and therefore, philosophy gives us such habit or frame of mind that is quite disciplined, more disciplined than day-to-day conversation. It also enlarges the human mind, right? Because thinkers that we study in philosophy are somehow like people who have navigated through life already, right? And they reflectively do so. In other words, these thinkers have also lived their own lives, of course, in their own social conditions, right? But they did so. They tried to create order from the chaos of their existence, right? Of their experiences. And at least there's a possibility that some of what they have learned will benefit us, and therefore we can use what they have learned in our own lives, right? So in a sense, if we do not study what they have said about what they have learned from life, the scope of action, the extent, the number of options that we could take in trying to live our life would be limited. So, philosophy, in a sense, enlarges the human mind. Right? So, Timothy Williamson also said that many contemporary philosophers assume that moral duties always outweigh aesthetic considerations of beauty and ugliness, unaware that they are making a substantive assumption. Right? Reading Friedrich Nietzsche could alert themselves to alternatives. So, the main point that we are drawing from this text from Williamson is that we rely too much on common sense, right? But if we encounter somebody who speaks a position that is totally different from what we think to be intuitive or self-evident or commonsensical, then we take a more critical stance towards such a view, right? So in other words, it enlarges the human mind because it enables us to think that there are also other positions that are perhaps reasonable to believe in, that are quite opposite to what we believe to be commonsensical. So it enlarges the human mind in that sense. Philosophy also humbles the human mind, right? According to Gregory Basham, time and time again, great thinkers have claimed to discover ultimate truth, only to be shut down in flames. So in other words, truth is an ideal that we attempt to attain. However, it is a difficult task to do so, to actually reach truth. And we do not have absolute certainty that we already possess truth at the time that we have it, unless you're God, right? So once you already have the try to claim that your worldview is complete and is the most accurate, or it is a completely accurate representation of what reality is, then you're probably wrong, right? So, at some point, we do not notice that some assumption of ours is false, right? So some philosophers have tried to think that they have captured reality, only for later philosophers or even contemporaries to refute them. Right? This is the point of Gregory Basham here. And Mortimer Adler said in his book, How to Read a Book, he says, you must be able to say, I understand, before you can say, I agree, or I disagree, or I suspend judgment. So the point here is that we sometimes get too prideful, assuming that we understand the position of somebody, and then we say, we object to that position, right? Or we agree to that position, or I'd like to suspend my judgment about the truth value of that proposition. Now, to do that, we must already have done the first act of the mind. So notice, in Aristotle, there are 3 acts of the mind, right? First is apprehension, second is judgment, third is reasoning. To be able to do the later, or the second act of the mind, for instance, which is judgment, you must have done the first one. You must have understood what you are judging about. So now, sometimes we are too quick to judge the truth value of some propositions, or even to suspend judgment about some propositions, even without having done the prior work of trying to understand what it really means, right? And philosophy humbles the human mind by forcing us to do the hard work first of trying to understand what we're talking about, who we're talking to, the position that we are trying to engage with, before judging its truth value, right? So that's it. Philosophy also saves the mind from the fragmentation of knowledge, right? As you might recall in the definition used for philosophy, taken from Norris Clark, he emphasizes how philosophy is an attempt to grasp the entirety of all reality, right? It attempts to place our experience in light of the coherent whole of reality. So this is similar to the statement of Sellars, right? Wilfrid Sellars, who said that the aim of philosophy is to understand how things in the broadest possible sense of the term hang together in the broadest possible sense of the term, right? So as we said last time, philosophy is the rebellion against the hyper-specialization that is sometimes present in academia, right? That results in a fragmentation of knowledge, and that is not a very ideal thing to have, because there's only one reality, right? The totality of true propositions in the world is coherent, and therefore they somehow are open to be integrated to each other, and therefore it seems problematic for us to have our knowledge fragmented into bits and pieces that do not interact and are not well or seamlessly integrated with each other. So philosophy gives us that, right? The capacity to put, for example, our field of study. For example, you're a psychologist, right? So if you also study philosophy as a psychologist, you're able to situate your special knowledge in psychology in light of the totality of human knowledge. If you're a historian, or if you are an educator, if you are, let's say, an engineer, or what have you, the study of philosophy enables you to put these particular fields of specializations in light of the totality of the human experience and of the human attempt to grasp at truth, or to reach truth. So that's it. Philosophy also maps the map. That's a mouthful. It maps the map by which you could order your life closer to the truth. So this is similar to what we said earlier about philosophy enlarging the human mind, but it is quite also distinct in the sense that this, for example, the statement of Alistair McIntyre, we can read, "I can only answer what am I to do if I can answer the prior question of what story or stories do I find myself a part." So either consciously or not, right? Either consciously or not, we have a map of reality, right? And in the words of Jordan Peterson, for example, in his book Maps of Meaning, he emphasizes how this map, this personal map that we have constructed for ourselves, is actually quite procedural in its purpose, right? In its intent, because a map, by its very nature as a map, right? This is the reason for the metaphor map. A map guides you in living in a certain location, right? It guides you in acting, for example, it guides you in your attempt to go somewhere, right? To a specific location. It shows you the barriers to the shortest way possible towards that position. Now, in other words, this is the map of reality that we have. Now, the study of philosophy gives you a chance to reflect critically on the map that you have built for yourself, and also it enables you to encounter some other maps that other people have constructed, right? Because my worldview, for instance, I'm a Catholic, right? So this worldview of mine, this map of mine, might be totally different from the worldview of somebody else, the map of somebody else. For example, of a Hindu, or a Protestant, or an Orthodox, or an atheist, right? They also have their own maps. And the study of philosophy enables you to compare your map with theirs and try to see which one is a better map of the world, which one better guides you in your attempt to reach your goal, your destination, right? So that comparison also presupposes that you really understand your own map, right? So in other words, I cannot just jump into another map if I do not grasp yet the map that I already have, right? Because the very fact that it is my map, that means that it has been working quite well for some point of my life, right? So in other words, before you jump to another map, know your own map first. So this is the point of McIntyre, that I can only answer what am I to do if I can answer of what story or stories do I find myself part, right? So action is predicated upon the type of map that we have adopted for ourselves, right? And the study of this map and comparing our own map to the maps of others is a task undertaken in philosophy. It gives you an opportunity to do that. And that's at least one of the reasons why philosophy is valuable or important or worth doing. Philosophy also forms the will, right? It forms the will. So, for example, the victim mindset, right, is quite counterproductive. In other words, we sometimes, instead of trying to push through life, we sometimes blame other people. We sometimes say or make excuses that we are only victims of the circumstances that we're in, right? That might be true, but it is not a very useful way of thinking to lead you to your goal, right? So the point here is that philosophy forms your will. You are able to defend yourself, right, from a way of thinking that is the victim mindset, right? That hides some resentment in it. So, how so? So, philosophy forms your will by showing you that there's a goal to be reached, and that you can there's an objective goal to be reached, and if you would be rational enough, then there is a reasonable path that could be taken for you to reach that goal. You might not have absolute certainty that is the correct means to get there, and that the goal that you have chosen for yourself is the best possible goal that there is. But at least you will not be trapped, right? You will not be trapped by the resentment, right, of the victim mindset. And it also forms the will. Philosophy also forms the will by forcing you to be authentic, right? We rarely ask the question, do you really believe that? Do I really believe that? We sometimes just borrow the positions of others and just assimilate them into our own. But do you really believe that? Philosophy forces you to reflect on such question. And if you have done so, then you are authentic to yourself, right? You really own your beliefs. Those beliefs that you have already are yours. Once you have done the task of philosophizing, once you have done the racing, you have asked the question honestly: do I really believe this, or I'm just believing this because this is what has been handed on to me, right? All right. Philosophy also nurtures wonder. Right? It nurtures wonder. Kenneth Gallagher has said. We look at my notes. Kenneth Gallagher has said, citing the ideas of Aristotle, that one of the major benefits of doing philosophy is that it forces you to step back, right? To have some distance with the obvious. So, one of the features of philosophy is that it is not limited to studying the very far removed objects of experience, right? Like galaxies that are light years away from the Earth, for example. No, although philosophy also studies those, it is not limited to those. Philosophy also studies the most accessible aspects of reality. For example, your very own identity, right? Your very self, or the things that you are handling in your day-to-day life. So, in other words, philosophy, by by forcing you to distance yourself at least a bit from the apparent self-evidence of the natures of these things, for instance, it forces you to ask some questions about it. So once you are very tangled up with it, right, with the things of your experience, it is almost impossible that wonder would arise, because you are already in close contact with it all the time. But once you set some epistemic distance, you bracket you bracket your way of thinking about it, and you stand back and start to wonder, to gaze at it and ask questions about it. Wonder is produced, right? Wonder emerges out of that experience, and therefore it expands our horizon of inquiry, right? So, in other words, philosophy nurtures wonder by forcing us to rethink our apparently self-evident biases, for example, or ways of thinking of the world, and therefore it expands our horizon of inquiry. Now, Clark also says, William Norris Clark, that to recognize as a prison is already to have reached beyond it in desire and imagination. Okay, so his point here, at least if we apply his statement to this context, talking about the value of philosophy, once the human being starts to realize that although the use of natural reason is very fruitful, for example, in helping us to attain certain knowledge, self-reflection on the usefulness, on the power of natural reason, at the same time shows that it is a prison, right? That it has a limit. But to see that it has a limit is somehow already to see an insight that there's something beyond that limit. Now, how do we access such facts that lie beyond the limits of what natural reason can know? Is it possible to access that? Right? And at least according to the Catholic theology, it is possible to access that through another means of knowing truth other than natural reason, which is somehow we might call supernatural reason, which is faith, right? Divine faith. Divine faith studies reality through the fonts, through the sources of scripture and tradition, right? So, in other words, philosophy forces us to expand our horizon of inquiry. So, it forces us to expand our horizon of inquiry by letting us see that natural reason has its limits, and therefore there's something beyond it. And once we ask questions about that reality outside of the reach of reason, we must use faith to do that, right? And therefore it opens the way towards revelation. Alright? So, next, philosophy also equips us on how to refute error. Okay? So, Langes, the Dominican, in his book, The Intellectual Life, says, for instance, what we have won by study and considered carefully must be guarded against unjustified second thoughts and scruples. So sometimes, we have already undertaken the task of proving a certain proposition, of demonstrating that it is true, but sometimes emotions sometimes alter our personal and subjective judgment of the truth of such proposition. Even if intellectually we already know that it is true, right? Doubts sometimes arise from emotion, although not all the time, but sometimes doubts do arise from emotion, especially when we have already done the task of demonstrating that it is true, that the arguments supporting it have true premises and valid structure. So once we have done that, then we are sure that it's true. But somehow a sense of uncertainty in our confidence in such position is sometimes due to the role of emotion, because human beings are not pure intellects, right? We are composite beings, and one of the other modes of interpretation of reality that we have is emotion, right? Other than reason. So once we get too scrupulous about our certitude in some proposition that we have already known to be true by natural reason, philosophy enables us to rediscover, right? To rediscover that we already have certain and strong foundation, and strong ground in believing what we have proven to be true, right? And therefore, our doubts are unjustified, right? So that's it. It equips us on how to refute error, right? Because sometimes such error arises out of irrational emotions, right? And applied to, for example, in a debate, it also philosophy also enables us to demonstrate, right, to another person, not just to ourselves, to another person, that some problem in their line of reasoning is present, for example, or for example, there's a false premise, there's an ambiguous term, for example, there's an equivocation, or there's a problem in the validity of the structure of their arguments, there's a false assumption of their argument, so there's an implication of their argument that is definitely false. So these doing these things are done a lot in philosophy. Philosophy trains us to do that, you know? So in other words, philosophy helps us. It equips us on how to refute error effectively, right? By appealing to laws of logic, which our interlocutor himself cannot deny to be binding, right? So we just show them that the laws of logic themselves show that his position is, when he bases them on arguments that are invalid. Next, philosophy is, so studying philosophy is a refusal to live a sham existence. This is emphasized by James Madden. He talks about Oedipus, right, in the Greek myth and drama, right? Ignorance is vincible, right? It is his fault that he's ignorant. So he lived a life with vincible ignorance. In other words, he did not live up to the call of Socrates to live an examined life. As we might recall, Socrates said that an unexamined life is not worth living. Right? If you do not examine your own life, you are living a shammed existence, in the words of James Madden. Right? So, philosophy forces us to rethink the way we live our life, the way we see the world and our place in it, and how we should interact with it. And by doing that, we are examining our own life, making it therefore worth living. Right. Immanuel Kant, in his text, What is the Enlightenment, has said, enlightenment is man's release from his self-incurred tutelage. Tutelage is man's inability to make use of his understanding without direction from another. So self-incurred is this tutelage when its cause lies not in lack of reason, but in lack of resolution, right? And courage to use it without direction from another. So sometimes we just parrot the ideas of somebody else, right? Uncritically. We treat ourselves just like a wallet, and that somebody else is the bank, right? And the money that comes from that bank just goes straight into our wallet, and we just adopt it as our own. So that is very uncritical. According to Kant, that is an unenlightened way of thinking. An enlightened person, right, will not just accept ideas of somebody else uncritically. He will do so only if he himself discovers that it is reasonable to do so, right? Because if we do not do that, if we just adopt a worldview, a position of somebody else uncritically, we are prone to living a shammed existence. Right? We inherit the errors that are included in that set of beliefs that we just uncritically adopt. So that's it. Philosophy enables us to live an examined life, and therefore it is a rebellion against a shammed existence. So we are taking responsibility for ourselves. We face the courage to use our reason, right? To resolve, to try to approximate truth as much as possible by thinking critically. And finally, philosophy is valuable because it is a return to childhood. What do I mean by that? Kraft, for example, says, Peter Kraft, in his book Christianity for Modern Pagans, he says, if the experts cannot answer a simple child's question, then the world has come to a pretty sorry state. So, in other words, the questions that are being raised typically by kids, for example, are pretty basic. As said in a past lecture, right? Remember that the core questions of philosophy are still existential. And these are the questions that kids already wonder about. And we tend to, as we grow up, we tend to put them aside because we have to live a life, right? We have to try to prepare to be able to provide ourselves for basic needs, to work. And we sometimes put these core questions, existential questions, aside. Now, philosophy, once we study philosophy as already a mature adult, we return to our childhood, right? We re-examine those core questions once again, now already equipped with, hopefully, a more advanced, a more developed a set of thinking processes, right? So, John Piaget, the philosopher of education, or in his own view, he is a genetic epistemologist. Right? What do we mean by, let's go to a tangent for a bit. What is genetic epistemology for Piaget? epistemology is the study, right, of knowledge, right? So Piaget sees in child development a mirror of the development of the entire human species. Remember, in Piaget, you move from the sensory motor stage, right, as an infant, to the pre-operational stage. Then I forgot the next one, until you reach the formal operational stage. For Piaget, these stages of development of the cognitive capacities of the child reflect the stages of the cognitive development of the human species, right, as a whole, across history, in the development of human thought, right? We underwent a stage of sensory-motor stage, then to somehow a pre-operational stage, then concrete, now I remember, concrete operational stage, and then the formal operational stage, which is mastered, for example, in mathematics, right? When human beings discover mathematics, when human beings discover physics, etc. Now, in other words, why did we go to the tangent? We went to the tangent because one of the ways in which philosophy is valuable is that it enables us to return to our childhood by looking at the history of the development of the cognitive aspect of the human being as it underwent different stages, right? So, for example, there are 250 milestones in the history of philosophy that we'll be tackling in this course, and by studying those milestones, we could at least see a glimpse of genealogy, right? That's what genetic epistemology means. A genealogy of the development of human thought across history, and through that we can see a glimpse of our own growth, right, from childhood until the day. So those are at least some of the reasons why philosophy is valuable, and there might be more, right? I just gave 10, and I hope I have convinced you at least, or perhaps if not, at least I'm being honest about my reasons for seeing why philosophy is valuable. You might have your own reasons, and if you do, feel free to share your thoughts.